Well, 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 France is on fire yet again. I don't think I've talked much about France, or at least riots in France, since the Yellow Vest protests were quashed by the coup lockdowns. But for those of you who are unaware, what's going on in France right now is very, very different from what went on with the Yellow Vests. I've been following the situation pretty much since it began on June 27th, when you had a 17-year-old guy of Algerian descent who was killed during a traffic stop in France. Apparently, in 2022, they said this like it's a big number, a total of 5 people were killed during traffic stops in France. And so the minorities are just fed up with it, and they're tired of being, they're victims of genocide, and so they are rising up against the white man, and they're going to overthrow the white regime. And, for me, watching this, it kind of feels like watching the Iran-Iraq war. It's the old trope. Can't they both lose? Like, I can't stand the French government, and I really don't have any sympathy for most of these minority communities in France, because I think if they were in charge, France would actually be even worse. The French people are bad enough, and then you've got all of these interlopers from North Africa who hitchhiked into Europe during the French evacuation of Algeria. They just got that, they used that to get their foot in the door, and since then it's been waves and waves of migrants from Africa coming into France, and now they decided that they want to own the place. But it's hard to have much sympathy for the French, because, frankly, they brought this upon themselves. You could say this for Europe at large, but they were not like the United States. At one time, all of these states across Europe were homogenous nation states, and politically they were organized along those lines. America is very different. America, has always been made up of people from around the world. We have been, since the founding of our centralized government in 1776, we've been a majority, you could say, non-native or descendant of non-natives. The Native American Indian tribes make up an absurdly small percentage of our population. And part of the reason for that is that there weren't that many of them to begin with, but also they were, victims of plagues and also genocide. And so as a result, we, the descendants of people from other parts of the world, are now in charge of America, and we define what it means to be American. Furthermore, because we have so many different groups in this country of different cultural backgrounds that cannot just be easily assimilated. These things take multiple generations, and at the end of the day, you end up with not assimilation into an existing culture. You end up with what they call the melting pot, and that's under the best of circumstances. So our culture, to the extent that there ever was a national American culture, and I think I don't want to make this all about America, but historically there was not one, and this is kind of one of the big reasons for it, because you have so many different groups, people coming from so many different parts of the world. Even just within Europe, you have so many different cultures that came and settled here in America. There's never really been a unified American culture. But places like France and Germany, that was not so much the case. Yes, you had regional cultures there, but for the most part, French people were French. We all kind of understand what that means. Certainly people in France understood what that meant. And so they were able to organize a highly centralized state in which most people generally agreed, and they at least had the same interests at heart, even if they had, political disagreements here and there. Yes, France has a history of political strife and unrest and revolutions and whatnot. But at the end of the day, all the people were fighting over they were fighting over what they thought was in the best interest of France and French people. But you cannot say that about what's going on right now. These are non-French people fighting for what they think is in their best interests, which might be very valid. You know, if I were in their shoes, I probably would want what's in my best interest, not what's in the best interest of the French people. But the French political system was not built to service the needs of outsiders. It was not designed to cater to them. It was designed to cater to the French. And so therefore these people feel disenfranchised. And this is why I have no sympathy really for either side. France introduced and has nurtured a population in their country which can never be assimilated into their society. People who have no interest in French culture, in French history, in French traditions will never be French in the sense that most people in France are French. And so therefore they can never be incorporated into your political system. This is ultimately why France had to evacuate the Department of Algeria. They learned that they could not make Frenchmen out of Algerians and that they were not wanted there. So they picked up every last one of their citizens and they got the hell out. But for some reason, they thought that it would be a good idea to bring some Algerians with them. If they couldn't make Algerians into Frenchmen in Algeria, what made them think that they could make Algerians into Frenchmen in France? Now, to be clear, the people rioting are, now some of them are new immigrants and things, but the French Algerians, so-called, who are rioting, these are not the people who came over, you know, in the 60s or the 50s, whenever it was. These are not the original people. These are like their grandchildren, or their great-grandchildren even, maybe, who knows at this point. These are kids who have grown up in France, whose parents grew up in France, who have probably never lived in another country, who may have never even been to Algeria. Yet they certainly are not French. They don't want to be French. They've made that clear. They understand that they are different. They like who they are. They don't want to be like everyone else. And that creates tension. Because they don't like to be policed by Frenchmen. They don't like being policed by people who they don't feel are a part of their community. And so France essentially has turned itself into South Africa. They have these little Bantustans all across the country. These densely populated urban centers, which are populated almost entirely by non-French people, where French is not the the dominant language, and yet they think that these areas will tolerate being governed by Frenchmen. You know, the apartheid regime understood this, and they tried to construct these regimes that they could, still control and were allied with them, but were ultimately led by members of those communities. And they were mocked internationally for this. But what was the alternative? The alternative was that you had South Africa entirely governed by the Boer population, which made up, 5 to 7%, depending on the year, I think. During the Cold War, I think maybe they peaked at 7% of the population, the Boers. I mean, you had the white Anglos as well, but anyway, the Zulus were much more likely to obey the rule of the Zulu king, who may have been friends with somebody like what's a South African president, P.W. Botha, right, or Botha, I forget how you say his name, or Hendrik Verwoerd, or however you say those, but I can't pronounce those Dutch names. But anyway, France essentially has Bantustans set up with no Bantustan governments. And so the Bantu peoples, and I mean that, I'm making an analogy here, they're not literally Bantu peoples, These are, from what I understand, I think this is mostly the French Algerian population, although France now has become a whole mosaic of Africans because they've brought in people from former French Africa. Again, for some reason. I couldn't tell you why someone from the Central African Republic belongs in France. You know, some of them may genuinely want to become a part of France, but for the most part, that's not what you get in these situations. But anyway, these people are rising up and saying, you know what, we're tired of being governed by you, the Frenchmen, and we decide that we would rather be the ones in charge of you. We would like to turn the tables. And that's a perfectly human instinct. And so I can't exactly fault them. I can't say that if I were in their shoes that I wouldn't do the same thing, that I wouldn't feel the same way. I probably would. After all, I'm not a big fan of the French as it is. And don't think that these people aren't serious. I've seen plenty of videos that they are, a lot of them at least, are well armed. They're ready to kill. They've got their guns out, and this is, you know, just despite the fact that we're told, oh, you know, Europe, they have gun control. Yeah, okay, there's still guns in Europe. Anyway, there are too few to truly take over France, but I think that they could win significant concessions across Europe, the migrant populations, because the white population of Europe is, frankly, scared shitless. And they hate themselves as it is. So, who knows? Perhaps they will secure some sort of Bantustan-esque home rule in their communities. Or at the very least, they may terrorize the white population into forever staying out of these towns and cowering in their own homes when they see any of the non-white peoples on their street, afraid of being accused of racism and having their house torched, being lynched. This might be a very sad reality if you were someone who lives in France, but this didn't happen overnight. This is the result of decades and decades of government policy. It's what happens when you don't treat your enemy the same way they treat you. If you try and be the bigger person and offer them concessions that they outwardly have fought to take away from you and that they believe you do not deserve, they're going to take advantage of you. They're going to walk all over you. And that's what's happened to the French and to people across Europe. After the end of colonialism, after the end of World War II, 50s and 60s, white people were driven from Africa en masse. There used to be a lot of Europeans who emigrated, who actually wanted to live in Africa. Now, I know that's impossible to think these days. Why would any European want to live in Africa? It's the Africans that want to live in Europe. Well, it used to be the opposite. A lot of Europeans wanted to go to Africa because there was opportunity there. They were fast-growing economies. They went to be farmers and things. All over, you know, people, you know, think the most about, like, Rhodesia. You know, that's kind of the poster child for, you know, white European settlers, you know, who settle down, and then a few decades later, in some cases, maybe even, you know, multiple generations. So you have children who grew up in Africa. They're told, no, actually, you have to leave, and you need to get out. But this happened all across Africa as colonialism was unwound. It happened in East Africa and Kenya. There were British farmers there. It happened in Algeria, as we know, with the French, and it happened in Libya with the Italians. As the post-colonial governments gained power, they decided that Africa should be for the Africans, not for the Europeans. And so they decided, we do not want these foreign populations who do not assimilate into our culture, but rather have their own culture. Certainly you didn't see Europeans assimilating into any of the local African cultures, whether they be Islamic or animist or what have you. They didn't start speaking African languages. They hung on to their own languages. And so various African regimes decided, or revolutionary movements decided, that they wanted the European population out, and they got that. The Italians were ethnically cleansed from Libya. The French were, quote-unquote, evacuated from Algeria. I love that euphemism. That's a great euphemism for ethnic cleansing. There was, of course, the somewhat slow removal, or whatever you want to call it, of the Rhodesians / Zimbabweans. And then, of course, you still have the white minority hanging on in South Africa, but they are steadily declining. They are fleeing Africa all the time. No one really, I don't think, I've never even met a white Kenyan, but they did exist at one time. Anyway, all of these peoples, all these European peoples who were distributed across Africa, they are gone. And in that time, African populations have been accumulating in Europe. And this sends the exact wrong message. We're not allowed to live in your country, but we'll let you live in ours. It sends a message of weakness, obviously. And it was only a matter of time before the migrant populations, whether it was the first generation, second, or the third generations, before they took advantage of this weakness, and they asserted their own national interests. Just as we saw the Europeans in Africa refuse to give up their European languages, the Arabs in Europe refused to give up their language. They refused to give up their religion. They have brought their culture to the new continent. They have colonized these countries. Now, they are still very small minorities, but they are colonists nonetheless. That is their agenda. And so the longer that the European public and European governments refuse to recognize this fact, the longer and the worse this unrest will become. So, with that said, I will continue monitoring this situation, and I will see you folks back here tomorrow.